The Psychedelic Report.
Psychedelic drugs
have played their part in America's long, strange trip toward an understanding of mind-altering drugs.
The Psychedelic News.
Leading physicians, scientists, and experts share their wisdom about psychedelic medicines and healing.
50 years ago, psychedelic drugs were at the center of America's counterculture.
The brightest minds in psychedelic medicine. The Psychedelic Report.
We use the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model that happens to have psychedelic effects that were not predicted when the drug was first developed.
From researchers to investors.
I think the biggest mistake we've made as a culture is the war on drugs.
To physicians to shamans and nonprofit pioneers.
Psychedelic drugs.
Recent research suggests some of them could have legitimate uses.
The Psychedelic News
brings you diverse perspectives from the front lines of this exciting movement. The Psychedelic Report.
The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. Welcome to the Psychedelic Report, your single source of truth for the psychedelic news. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Rabin. I'm a neuroscientist and psychiatrist trained in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well as MDMA-assisted therapy. Today we have a very special conversation to bring you. This conversation started back in 2016 when I first met Dr. Rick Doblin after the Horizons conference at a fundraiser in New York City. At that time, the phase 2 trial results with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD had just come out, and we were seeing some of the best, most promising results from any treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder to date. This was really exciting because for those who aren't familiar with these results, we've struggled to treat post-traumatic stress disorder for decades in this country. The National Institutes of Mental Health was actually founded to treat PTSD, once called shell shock or battle fatigue, back in 1949. And it's still not had treatments that work for more than 50% of people who have this condition, which is not the best statistic. And we haven't had a lot of new FDA cleared treatments for this condition. So more than 50% of people who are ever diagnosed with PTSD continue to be ill for their entire lives. The study of MDMA-assisted therapy and the trials that have been led by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, have been nothing short of groundbreaking. The phase 2 trial that was conducted in roughly 100 veterans with severe treatment-resistant PTSD showed, for an on average of 17.6 years without relief, showed that with just 3 doses of MDMA and 42 hours of psychotherapy combined with 2 therapists over a 12-week period, that after that treatment, roughly 55% of the individual participants no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. What's more is that as we follow these subjects 1 year out after treatment has been discontinued in the study, that 55% number actually goes up to 67% without any additional treatment offered as part of the trial. This is the first time that we have ever seen a treatment have such promising results in the short term that actually continue to improve in the long term without continued treatment. In the field of psychiatry currently, we are taught, and the data shows that most of our treatments, like those with Prozac and Zoloft, and many other SSRI medications for depression and PTSD, people actually get worse after the medications are stopped. So this 3 doses of MDMA and 42 hours of psychotherapy is doing something different to the body that's inducing long-lasting results. Long-lasting results that continue for at least a year out where people are still getting better. And this was really interesting to us because as scientists and psychiatrists and mental health practitioners, we had never seen this before. And so back in 2016, I went to Rick Doblin and asked him if he would be interested in studying this outcome and trying to understand if it would be possible to detect a signature in the body that could predict how well somebody was going to respond to MDMA-assisted therapy and to predict who was going to respond. And if there was what we call a biomarker on the DNA or around the DNA, which we call epigenetic, that modifies the DNA that helps us to remake memory of trauma and remake the way that trauma is stored in our bodies, or to repair the way that trauma gets stored in our bodies. The reason why this became interesting is because Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who we've interviewed on a couple prior shows,
at the Psychedelic Report talking about this topic, was one of the first people to discover that traumatic events actually result in a modification of our epigenetic code around our cortisol receptor genes. And that these modifications of the epigenetic code at the cortisol receptor actually impact the way that our bodies interact with cortisol when we're traumatized. And especially when we have a diagnosis like PTSD. And if this is happening in a way in our bodies where the memory of the trauma or the traumatic event or what happened after the traumatic event is actually stored not just in our neurons, but actually on the DNA code that tells our DNA what to turn up and what to turn down, then the theory was that this could potentially be passed on to future generations. And subsequent studies have shown that without a doubt, that is actually what happens in animal models. That traumatized animals can actually pass down these epigenetic modifications to their stress response genes like cortisol receptors, and that increases the likelihood of their offspring developing symptoms of these conditions in the animal models. So this is really fascinating. So we thought, well, if MDMA-assisted therapy is with just 3 doses and 42 hours of psychotherapy producing these dramatic, long-lasting results where people are getting over 50% of people are getting better in the short term. And then that number goes up to 67% in a year out without additional treatment as provided by the study group. Then perhaps the process of healing with MDMA-assisted therapy is actually repairing some of the changes that were caused by trauma to the stress response genes on the epigenetic level. And if so, would it be possible to measure them? So we put together a study group. And the study group was led by Dr. Candace Lewis, who will be joining us today, along with colleagues at USC, Dr. Rael Khan, Dr. Rachel Yehuda at Sinai, Dr. Ben Kelmendi at Yale, and Dr. Joe Tafur at Modern Spirit, as well as Dr. Bara Yazar-Klasinski at MAPS, and a few other people to help us figure out, is this actually happening? If MDMA-assisted therapy is causing these dramatic improvements in people's symptoms of PTSD after just 3 doses and 12 weeks of therapy, is it possible that we can measure those changes on the cortisol receptor genes? Is this therapy process actually repairing our biology in some way? So we started that study in conjunction with the MAPS phase 3 trial, which was just finished, where we sampled patients who were going through this trial with MDMA-assisted therapy before and after to collect some of their saliva and determine whether or not these changes were happening. And this paper was published with this team in February of 2023, which was a very exciting pilot trial that showed the very first evidence that MDMA-assisted therapy is actually resulting in a statistically significant repairing or modification of these trauma-induced changes at the cortisol receptor gene site. And this gives us an incredible number of clues and a tremendous amount of insight into what's happening in the body when we experience trauma and traumatic events, and what happens in the body when we heal. And so with that, I couldn't be more excited to bring you a conversation with the lead author on this manuscript, Dr. Candace Lewis. Candace Lewis is an assistant professor with a dual appointment in the School of Life Sciences and Department of Psychology at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on the impact of early life social experiences on epigenetic regulation of gene systems involved in mental health, the relationships between peripheral epigenetics and brain structure, function, microbiome composition, and behavior, and the potential of psychedelic-assisted therapy to reduce symptoms through psychological healing and epigenetic alterations. Dr. Lewis's research has been funded by the Science Foundation Arizona, the Fulbright Association, and the National Institutes of Health.
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
Such a pleasure to have you today with us, Candace. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you start by telling us a little bit about what got you into this research space?
Of course, Dave. I'm so happy to be here. So my original research goals in graduate school was to look at the effects of stress on different behaviors, different maladaptive behaviors throughout the adulthood. I started in an addiction lab. So we started looking at early life stress and how it impacts increased vulnerability towards addiction-like behaviors. And then I learned about epigenetics, and it really blew my mind open. And from there, my whole career has been centered around understanding how traumatic experiences can shape behavior through altering molecular regulation of genes that are coding for brain structure and function. And that's a mouthful. But at the end of the day, it's pretty simple. We've always known, or we've known for a really long time, at least over 100 years, right? That trauma is going to influence the way that people behave a lot of times. And now that behavior is something that we call mental illness. But we haven't known, even since we have learned that the brain is the basis for behavior. How is it that these traumatic experiences are changing brain that changes behavior?
We've also noticed from like 100 years of research, I believe, that the offspring of people who have experienced trauma also are at higher risk of mental illness, right?
Yes. And that is a very tricky, sticky area of research that I would love for us to get back to if you want to note that. Okay. So during this time, I was in the addiction lab. So I was, becoming an expert on the pharmacology of different classes of drugs. And I was investigating how trauma was influencing increased methamphetamine self-administration. And we were looking at epigenetic modifiers that were kind of behind that change in behavior. So while all of this is all circling around, I'm a young, bright, ambitious graduate student. And I started kind of realizing that I'm learning more and more about this class of psychedelics and the low toxicity levels, right? Like some of them we have not found yet the deadly dose. And I'm learning a lot more about the propaganda, right? Like a lot of my studies were about the history of drugs. So I learned about Hoffman, and I learned about all of the research that was going on before they became Schedule I substances. And then that pointed me towards the research that was going on then. So this was in 2014. So then it was like the really early small samples, the small trials that were happening in the cancer patients, looking at using psilocybin-assisted therapy to treat depression and anxiety. And I was like, wow, like this is really interesting. This is so different from what I'm looking at drugs. Like I'm looking at drugs and how our negative experiences can impact our vulnerability towards abuse. But this is like the opposite model. This is looking at how these powerful and potent and spiritual and salient experiences induced by drugs can lead to the healing. So in all of that, I kind of started realizing that classes of drugs was important. And that this country's not doing us any favors by kind of grouping them together in our very poor attempt at educating people about drugs.
Not all drugs are created equal.
Yes. I mean, in such a way that it's like calling anything edible food, right? It's like, well, there's a lot of different types of food. So that kind of became a passion of mine. And then I also saw this inverse relationship about how this psychedelic experience was salient and led to behavioral changes, which was so similar to the idea of trauma being salient and leading to behavioral changes. So that was all around my last year of PhD, which was in 2015. And I remember sitting down and telling my best friend and girlfriend at the time, now baby daddy in life, that I'm going to go into psychedelic research. They're like, what? And I was like, yeah, but this was before it blew up. This was before New York Times was having an article every other week and yada, yada. And so I applied for a Fulbright and cold called Franz Fuldenweider in Zurich in Switzerland. I was like, hey, I want to work with you. And at that moment, I had no experience in neuroimaging. I was an animal behaviorist. And so I was a neuroscientist. So I was very much at the cellular and genomic levels in behavior. And luckily for me, my wife was a then postdoc at like the great institute, Barrow Neurological Institute, doing neuroimaging. So I was lucky enough to kind of have her pre-train me. And I went off to Switzerland and worked with Franz doing neuroimaging with psilocybin in healthy participants. So since then, I've been working towards my lab has these two distinct but related research areas, and one being the effect of social exposures like trauma on epigenetic regulation of genes involved in mental health. And we usually do this with twin and or singleton populations. And we always combine the changes in epigenetics with some kind of downstream physiology or behavior. And then the other arm of our research platform is looking at psychedelics and how they can be in therapeutic and potentially through epigenetic markers, which leads me to the really great paper that you and I put out together recently.
Yeah, this is all very exciting, to hear. And I think your path as an investigator is a really interesting one, because you went down a very traditional path of training and let the evidence that you were finding with your, unrelenting curiosity as a researcher kind of guide you towards this career path, which has ultimately resulted in a lot of really incredible work that's come out of your lab. And And it's, I think this is a great segue into, the manuscript that we published together in this past year in Frontiers in Psychiatry, which is called a pilot study suggests DNA methylation of the glucocorticoid receptor gene NR3C1 is associated with MDMA-assisted therapy treatment response for severe PTSD. And this is really interesting to me because, we worked on this study with a group of very skilled investigators, including Dr. Rachel Yehuda and many others across and at MAPS and, a big group that collaborated to make this happen. But you were the lead author and really pushed to move this paper forward and get it published and surfaced to the community. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about this publication is it seems to be really showing the first inklings that trauma that you're talking about that's recorded biologically in our bodies is actually reversible, and that MDMA-assisted therapy is some of the first evidence that we can reverse it in a short time frame. And that may be too much of a simplification of the findings, but I would love to hear from you, why is this such a meaningful publication and why did you spend so much time trying to get this over the line for the scientific community?
Yeah, all really great questions. It was a big group. It was a lot of effort. And I do really think that while it was a pilot study and replication absolutely needs to be happening in bigger sample sizes, it was a very important paper. And going to, why it was so important is kind of back to this original point that I was making is in the same way that we don't really understand how it is that the trauma experience, or that we're now starting to understand how the trauma experience can change behavior. How is it that therapeutic experiences are changing behavior? Like we all get this. We all get that the idea is to go to your therapist once a week, once every couple of weeks, and you like talk through and you process, and there's some CBT going on, right? Like you're learning ways of altering your cognitions that are going to help you have better perceptions and emotions and behaviors in the world. However, where's the biology, right? And like I'm a neuroscientist, so I always want to know where the biology is for that. So in this paper, we're kind of the first to put it out there that like perhaps the psychedelic therapeutic experience is reducing symptoms through epigenetic changes. Now, it's not that we're claiming only psychedelic therapy can be working through this mechanism. It's just the model that I'm most interested in looking at because of how efficacious it is, and because it mirrors the saliency of trauma in a lot of ways, not just the emotional experience, but also physiologically. So physiologically, when we have this acute stress response, we're going to be flooded with a hormonal milieu, including your monoamines, so dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, stress hormones like cortisol, the slower stress hormone cortisol, right? So like your body's having this physiological response to a trauma, and a lot of similar physiological responses are happening to the pharmacological agents of psychedelics like MDMA and psilocybin. And then on top of that, you have this like similar psychological experience where it's really, really intense. With trauma, it's intense disconnection from safety. And with psychedelics, I call it disconnection from like safety, self. And then with the psychedelic experience, you can have an intense experience of connection with safety and self. So that's why I'm more interested in the psychedelic model and looking at these epigenetic mediators.
And in such a short time. Right?
Yes.
Part of the thing that was so fascinating to me about the MDMA trials that we measured the participants for this particular study that you led is that we're talking 12 weeks, right? It's 12 weeks and just 3 doses of MDMA is inducing this statistically significant remodeling of this particular cortisol receptor site that's implicated in PTSD. And it's short duration, not lifelong treatment required to get to this reversal.
Absolutely. And again, mirroring the trauma experience, it does not have to be a long trauma exposure to induce symptoms. And then, okay, back to one of the words you used, because I'm careful with this word, is the idea of reversing. So I think that much more data and much larger sample sizes are going to need to be conducted to really unpack what's happening. We don't know for sure, is the trauma leading to a signal in the therapy reversing that signal, or are there just other changes in the signal that are leading to the therapy response? And I know it kind of sounds like nuance, but I think it's really interesting because One, I never want to give the message that someone's trauma is going to completely leave them, because I don't think that it is. It will always be a part of them.
Memories don't really go away.
Right. And even in classical behaviorism, they have a saying that no one unlearns something, they learn something new, right? And referring to classic extinction paradigms. So extinction paradigms is when, that you have an animal who within a certain stimulus is going to have a predictable response because of the associations. This is very relevant research to PTSD, right? When we talk about triggering cues. So in extinction, you continue to give the cue, but without the associated thing. So this is how exposure therapy works in phobia treatments. And the idea is the conditioned response extinguishes. Now, if you reintroduce the cue with the associated stimuli, the response comes right back. They don't have to relearn it. So It never went away. They just learned something new. And so for me, that's how I like to look at the epigenetics. Like the biological marks, the biological recordings of your trauma will always be there. It will always be a part of you. I think that what we are measuring is some biological changes, looking at your new adaptive strategies, your new coping strategies, your new narratives, your new chosen responses that need to be practiced.
Yeah, I think that's a great discrimination that you made. And I think that what's interesting about that is what we're seeing in terms of this change in methylation at this particular cortisol receptor site suggests that the treatment, the MDMA-assisted therapy treatment in that 12 weeks in people with severe treatment-resistant PTSD is suggesting that this shift in methylation at this receptor site is actually making the cortisol receptor work more the way it's supposed to, right?
That's the interesting thing to think about. With HPA systems, you'll see the word dysregulated a lot. And that's because with depression, with large depression studies, we typically see a hyperactive cortisol response, meaning that in response to a stressor, their cortisol levels are going to go higher up than someone without depression. And cortisol is also a physiology that has a daily diurnal rhythm. So for all of us, 30 minutes after awakening, we have our cortisol peak response, and it decreases throughout the day. So we can look at the cortisol system in your natural diurnal rhythm and in response to a stressor. And with depression, both of those are related to hyperactive, so more cortisol. However, and Rachel Yehuda is a major player in these original findings, in PTSD, we see a hypoactive HPA response, meaning we have less cortisol in the system. So both ways we see as dysregulated. So whatever is supposed to be working, I think is a moving mark and could be different for different people, which is a really good segue into some really interesting analyses that we did in this paper.
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
So in this paper, we decided to look at not just increased methylation or decreased methylation. We wanted to look at the absolute change in methylation. And I think this is really important because the trauma literature is very clear that the results are all over the place, and that with trauma, sometimes we find increased methylation at these markers, and sometimes we find decreased. Either way, the trauma is leading to dysregulation. So in my mind, if trauma can dysregulate in either direction, then therapies can regulate in either direction. And I think it's important to kind of think about that instead of higher or lower. And I do like what you said, like more towards the point at which this person is regulated. I like regulated more than what should be happening.
Agreed.
Yeah,
I think that's a great, because when we talk about health, we're talking a lot about like balance, right? We're talking about reestablishment and maintaining of balance and homeostasis, the body's physiological balance.
Absolutely. I'm teaching neurobiology to undergrads right now, and I'm constantly just like interrupting my own lecture to show to them. I was like, see how everything about the brain is always seeking balance. We have responses. Our brain is responding to things all the time. And there's so many levels of mechanisms to get us back to where we were before the response. And to be a living organism in this world, we have to be able to respond, but we have to actually get ourselves back to how we were before the response too, which is just such a beautiful, beautiful way of explaining trauma, that when it does impact a person to the point of mental health issues, their physiology has not been able to get back to the balance.
Right. And then there's markings of that we can track,
yes,
which is so interesting. And I guess as I'm hearing you talk about this, it reminds me of the old definitions of trauma that we were using, your conversation that I have a lot in my world around establishing balancing between the sympathetic survival nervous system and the fight or flight, and then the parasympathetic rest and recovery nervous system also maps to sympathetic survival fear response, parasympathetic recovery safety, right? And fear triggers the sympathetic survival response reliably, and safety triggers the parasympathetic recovery response. And I feel like this almost by the way that we're thinking about this and what this data from the study is showing, I feel like is calling for a redescription or a redefinition of the way we think about trauma and healing experiences.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. Like, I think that the standard, and I think you're referring to like the old definition of trauma, but in a lot of ways, it's still standardly used. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, what you're referring to is that pretty short list of like experience and or threat of harm, or witnessing of threat or harm, or like near death experiences, right? Like those very kind of like physical experiences related to like physical harm and physical death, right? And death. And yeah, no, I'm all for expanding it. Sexual trauma is also in that list. I recently had someone in a meeting who was kind of like getting introduced to me, and kind of in a challenging way said to me, he's like, well, what are your definitions of trauma? And I was like, oh, honey, I mean, it's long. I don't even know if we can define it. I think at the end of the day, that a childhood in which you are in constant belief that you have to earn your parents' love, right? Either through like achievement in academics or sports, or in acting a certain way or whatever, like this compounds over the years, and that absolutely can lead to a trauma response.
Right.
And what I mean by trauma response is behaviors that now are listed as clinical, right? So like depression and anxiety, OCD, all the anxiety disorders, right? So like OCD being one of them.
This is important note. I want to just touch on this for a second, because a lot of people don't understand what you just said, even people who are practicing in the field, is that depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, eating disorders, OCD, and many other mental illnesses are actually, even ADHD we've seen, is actually manifestations of unresolved trauma.
Yep. I mean, yeah, I agree with that. So also I work in the field of genetics, right? So I have to be the voice that balances all the worlds. And I don't remember his name, so you're going to have to help me remember his name. So-and-so authored a book a couple of years ago, and he wanted to interview me about this. He's big in the trauma world, and he was asking my opinion on this, about the like psychiatric illness and these behaviors that we call symptoms is actually just a manifestation of trauma, and genetics don't play a role. And I refuse to give him what he was looking for, because it's not true. There are genetic signals. However, so by genetic signals, that means tons of spots on your DNA, right? There's not just one gene. There's not one variant. Multiple from different disorders. It could be like in the tens to the hundreds of single nucleotide polymorphisms. So SNPs, SNPs can contribute
in the DNA itself.
In the DNA, yes. So this is not epigenetics. This is in your nucleotide sequence inherited from your parents. When we combine all of those effect sizes, we can see your risk for a disorder. It is not a causal, right? It is a risk. And what's coming out more and more and more in these GWAS, these large genetic studies, is that these genetic risks have high overlap for the different things that we call anxiety and mood disorders. Right. And I would say it's like this genetic predisposition to how it is you're going to respond to trauma. And right. I think that was actually a phrase that him and I used to get together. There's like...
Not Gabor Mate.
Yes. Thank you. I was like, Gabor Mate.
Yeah. Oh, he interviewed me for his book as well.
Yay, I wonder if we're in the same book. Someone messaged me recently, was like, I'm reading a book in your interview. And I was like, do I sound good? I haven't even read it.
It's a good one.
Okay,
I haven't finished it yet, but it's good.
So, and I really wanted to stick to it. There's, we cannot lie about there being a genetic component. I think that with the lay people, it just gets very confusing that when they hear the word genetic, they think causal. Right. And also the trauma is not causal. It is this infinite, complex interaction throughout your whole life. And that's not even bringing in what were your protective factors, right? So right. Everyone is just so different. But moving on from genetics is that epigenetics is different. Epigenetics is dynamic. Epigenetics is changing throughout the lifespan. Epigenetics is related to your genetics. However, with more and more research, we can disentangle what are the epigenetic markers that are responding to your environment? And I think the more we can disentangle the trauma responsive epigenetic markers, the more we're going to be able to target those for trauma treatment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's, I think what's so exciting about this for this finding for the general mental health community, including mental health clinicians and providers, is it shows us that, there may be an opportunity to actually heal people long term from these different trauma related illnesses, right? That it's not just you have to take medicine every single day for the rest of your life, or you have to go to therapy, for the rest of your life, or you're going to relapse. It's, hey, there are actually long-term changes that, because the epigenetic layer, which almost, I like to think of the epigenetic layer that's on the DNA, it almost like sits in between the environment and the DNA, and it's recording stuff from the environment that's happening and telling the DNA what to turn up and what to turn down and what to keep the same, and how to express itself effectively and over time. And the fact that that is modifiable is fascinating, because up until even 5 or 10 years ago, actually it was probably up until like 3 years ago, when that giant umbrella study from University College London was published, I think it was still in the mainstream psychiatry practice to believe that a lot of mental health is genetic, and that people are born with a causal, they're born with, if something happens in their lives and you're born with the following, that you are going to develop mental illness. And that got passed down to the community. And that's not changeable, right? We can't change our DNA. If our DNA changes, it often results in cancer, and that's bad. But epigenetics being modifiable, I think, puts out a lot of hope that we actually can change the paradigm of the way we approach mental health to be something that has to be treated for life because you've got it genetically and you've got it for good, versus we can actually do something here, and we can start to have biomarkers that actually allow us to measure the outcomes of healing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, okay. And another thing that I think that this is all kind of circling around is our current use of the term disorder and diagnoses. So I find this a lot that, there's just these pendulum swings. So before, late 1800s, early 1900s, depression was laziness, or maybe it was just like a melancholy personality, and substance use disorders was the lack of character, and then we've had this really great pendulum swing that's been like, oh no, wait, don't think this person just kind of sucks at life. There's these biological things going on that are out of their control. And that was a really good thing that needed to happen to get us away from just people's personality or character sucking. However, and I think that's where we get to where you are, it's but it's not just because it's biology doesn't mean it's genetics. And so right now, but because we're there, where people have this understanding that it's biological.
It doesn't mean it's permanent.
Genetic. Yes, exactly. Well, so people will say, I'll hear people say well, I've seen studies and ADHD absolutely is a real disorder and it is biological. So let's unpack that a little bit. Right now, we're all using the DSM-5. That's how you're getting your diagnoses in this country. And what that is a checklist of symptoms. And if you self-report those symptoms in a way that checks enough of them, you have a disorder. We are not assessing anything about your trauma history, your genetics, your brain function, nothing. You are self-reporting those behaviors, and that's what we call disorder. And the reason why this system is in place and works for right now is because in order for you to receive services for these behaviors that are impacting your life, we have to use a disorder code. We just have to. So, if your child is having some speech delays and having some social impairments, so they get the diagnosis of autism. Does that mean that something is inherently different about their brain and they'll have autism the rest of their life? No, it means they need services.
Right.
And I was just looking at this. I don't remember the age range, but it's 10% of early life ASD diagnoses get reversed because they've received the services, and then that list of behaviors went away. So the diagnosis went away. This can also be thought about with ADHD and depression and all of these things. There's a moment in time where your behaviors are checking this list. That gives you a disorder, which allows you to get services for these behaviors. That's the clinical world. Okay. Now, in the research world that I'm in, yes, we want to understand the biological mechanisms underneath. However, we are nowhere near for any mental health disorder being able to say, this is what's going on, because they're so freaking complex. So a good example I'd like to give is, there's been lots of studies and it's pretty well established that at a group level, individuals with schizophrenia have smaller ventricles. Ventricles are like the hollow spaces within your brain where your cerebral spinal fluid is made and circulates. Okay. That's pretty established. At the group level, there is not a single person that we can put into an MRI and say your ventricles are so small that you definitely have schizophrenia. And this is another part where it gets really, really difficult in talking with the lay population between science and them wanting really badly to understand these things. That individual level markers for mental health, we don't have them yet.
Right.
That's why the clinic is still depending on your behavioral checklist. In research, we're talking about things at the group level. So there's the complexity of the pathophysiology underlying these behaviors is just immense. And it's just important to me that people understand that, like, when you have a disorder, you are check marking some behaviors. But I really love our study that shows that we can try to like target perhaps some of your life events markings on your epigenome. Let's target that area of the epigenome to create new pathways for more adaptive behaviors.
Right. Yeah, it's so cool. I mean, it's like one of the few manuscripts that I've seen that really demonstrates like a very tangible interface between, like a understandable interface between psychology, the way we think and feel in our human conscious experience, and our behavior, and draws a relationship to our psychoneurobiology, like what's actually happening underneath the surface and how do they relate to each other, which is a great transition point, I think, to some of your current work. That sounds really exciting in the same vein, which is, these associations between peripheral epigenetics and brain functioning. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
It's a big thing in the world of epigenetics, right? So in human studies, for very obvious reasons, it's hard to get brain tissue, especially pre and post-treatment brain tissue. So a lot of human studies looking at epigenetics and mental health, we use peripheral samples. Peripheral samples just meaning that it's not coming from your central nervous system or your brain. So the most commonly used are blood and saliva and or buccal samples, which are your cheek cells. So there's so much research now, including our paper, showing these relationships between your trauma exposure and your mental health behaviors. We're finding these epigenetic signals in these peripheral samples, but no one really knows what that means. I've been reading a lot lately in like 2023 papers. They keep saying, well, it doesn't really seem like the peripheral epigenome, it could be a mechanism for mental health behaviors. I'm like, of course it's not a freaking mechanism, dude. We're talking about your cheek cells. Like, but anyways, people are trying to figure it out. I don't think I'm measuring mechanism in my peripheral samples. What I think I'm measuring is a peripheral signal of something going on in the brain.
Right.
So I see it as proxy. I see it as a way of kind of looking into the brain by measuring the peripheral samples. Now, is the epigenetics in the brain a mechanism? I think so. That's not what I'm measuring. So something that our lab is really diving into to try to get this figured out more is associating peripheral epigenetic markers with neuroimaging. So within the same person, looking at their brain structure and function, looking in regions where we know this gene is expressed. So then looking at the brain region areas that we know this gene is expressed, and then seeing how we can relate that to the peripheral epigenetic markers of that gene. And we have some really exciting results coming out soon. We've looked at peripheral white matter genes having high associations with white matter, with total white matter volume. We're also looking at stress-related genes, DNA methylation being related to hippocampal and amygdala volumes. So a lot of exciting stuff going on there. My lab also runs animal research as well. And we have a lot of projects coming up in the vein of translational research, trying to assess what can we find out from these animal models where we can look at blood, buccal, and brain epigenetics, and how is that going to relate to what we can interpret about human peripheral epigenetics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's trying to target this long unanswered question of what is happening in the body, right? If indeed the mind and the body are connected, which we now know them to be, what's happening in the body when we're having changes in the brain, and then what's happening in the brain as we see changes in the body?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love that you said that, right? Like, well, we know the mind and the body are connected. It's like, because that question, really stems from the field of philosophy, which my first Psychology 101 course, I was told, this is the field of philosophy and biology having a baby. And I was just like hooked from day one, right? But the thing is, we are like, so even those of us who are not have a philosophy background, or those of us who do not have a psychology background, the field of biology, we are inheritors of a very long way of thinking, which is that somehow your brain and body are not the same system and they're unrelated to each other. And I think that very deep-seated like perspective influences a lot of research. And I hope to help make it go away. Like your mental experience is influencing your physical health. And your physical health is influencing your mental and psychological and emotional and cognitive abilities and experiences. This is another thing that's really big coming out in the microbiome research, right? Which we have our lab dabbles in that as well. But I don't want to be thought of a microbiome researcher, but we have some papers in it. But really, yeah, like really what we're showing there, so we can think about microbiome, like it's exposure. You know, the organisms that you have living inside of you are there because of different exposures, and what they're doing inside of your body is giving you constant exposure. And now more and more and more, we see how that your unique colony is influencing your brain function.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think, it's so important to reevaluate and dispel these old ways of thinking that aren't consistent with the way we now know things to be. And honestly, I think that's one of the biggest struggles that we have in the modern field of modern medicine and science is how do we go back and reevaluate some of these presumptions or dogma that came from the 1800s, right? Like Descartes. And
I think the mind body thing, even like, it's like I think therefore I am with Descartes, but then even going back to the spa philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, right? They even go back there to talking about the difference between body and mind. Right. So it's deeply rooted. I don't think you and I are going to be able to uproot it in our generation, but we're going to try.
I don't know. I think we can. I think change happens a lot more quickly every generation. We see so much happening now with technology and the way we think about ourselves and the phone. And right now, our ability to disseminate information worldwide is greater than ever. And I think this is our opportunity in the neuroscience and psychiatry and research field to really step in and educate our community at large and say, hey guys, look, the evidence says if you're emotionally unwell and you don't do anything about it, you're going to get physically sick. We know that happens. And if you're physically unwell and you don't do anything about it, you're going to get emotionally and mentally ill, right? And we know that happens. And so it's kind of
so clear. I think that people don't even realize that things will come out of their mouth, and I'll be like, hey, do you realize that like what you're implying is this? And they're like, oh, I didn't even realize that. And bringing it back to psychedelics, doesn't this make it even all more fun and interesting, right? Because like really what we're talking about here is how this like pharmacologically induced, but psychological experience that is so entwined with these non-science words like unity and spirituality. And they're like, I know, which I love, right? And how, and having to kind of like reverse translate this. It's like, psychedelics are blowing a hole in a lot of it. And I was a special editor on a recent psychedelics collection. It was called What's Up with Psychedelics Anyway. And in the editorial that I wrote, I did one of those word map things that shows like the amount of words, the amount of times a word was used. And I just kind of like reduced it to this list of non-scientific words. And you can see how often they're used in the scientific journal collection of studies. And I just think it's really beautiful. In fact, I think beautiful was one of the words.
It's really, really interesting. And, I think just so we don't miss the opportunity to talk about it, I think that, you have this really interesting study going on right now that is currently funded to study, speaking of the mind body, to study Alzheimer's in aging mice with using psilocybin. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we were funded by the state of Arizona Alzheimer's Consortium, which is a fantastic group of researchers here in the state that's been around for a long time. So we'll be looking at the effects of psilocybin on cognitive abilities and epigenetics in aged mice, kind of with the idea of maybe seeing some protection against typical cognitive aging. So it's not an Alzheimer's disease model mouse. It's just typically aging mice. However, we know that, quite a proportion of us will have typical aging reduction in cognitive ability. So we're just going to see if psilocybin in the mice model can be protective against that and potentially find epigenetic mediators of that effect.
Yeah, the early data that comes from cell biology studies and some population-wide studies would suggest that you're going to see positive results from that study, but it's a very interesting area to look
I'm
at.
excited. I'm excited. The cognitive world, there's a lot out there with hypotheses. And, I know that there was some clinical trials have been registered for a while that state that they're looking at the benefits of psilocybin treatment on mental health in these populations. I'm assuming they're also looking at cognition, but we have yet to really see a whole lot published in actual data of the world of psychedelics and cognitive abilities. So I'm excited. I'm excited for this data.
Yeah, from all of this, I think a big takeaway is that this is a lot of foundational work. And so it opens doors for everything else that needs to come to really show us what's happening. And we don't have all the answers yet, right? That's the nature of discovery and research, but we've made some really important headway, and your work especially has been really promising and exciting to shed light on different areas of the field. And I just think it's really interesting to think about how, all the potential here for psychedelics, not just in terms of what psychedelic medicines have to teach us about the brain and the mind-body relationship, but also their potential to treat some of these thought to be previously untreatable illnesses, right? Terminal illnesses like dementia and even mental illnesses. Many of them have thought to be, incurable. It reminds me of the discovery of antibiotics, right? When prior to penicillin being first discovered, syphilis was a terminal illness. You were going to die, right? There wasn't infections could easily take your life or result in the amputation of a limb, and that was commonplace. So this is in the field of mental health. This is almost like it may be, we don't necessarily have all the answers yet, but it may be akin to the discovery of an antibiotic type level treatment for mental illness, which is just so exciting.
Love the paradigm shift. Love it. And I do want to say that for this animal study, we are, my lab is very excited that we got a new member, Dr. Sarah Menenga, who has been part of the New York University Psychedelic Center, the Lagoon Psychedelic Center, since 2015. So she has come over and she's helping us really launch the animal portion of our research platform. Fun fact, Sarah and I went to grad school together. And so we were two of the top of our class, and we graduated the same year, the same degree. And I went off to Switzerland to work with Franz, and she went off to New York University to work with Ross and Bogenschutz. So it's really fun to be back together and leading a lab together. Two really strong women PIs in this field, I think, is a thing that's been needing to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And it's really exciting to hear that she's joining you over there in this work. And, I'm curious, just to wrap up on the mouse psilocybin study, are you looking at, or maybe you don't know yet, but are you planning to look at full macro dose, like peak dose levels of psilocybin in these animals? Or are you planning to look at long-term, more like microdose, subthreshold levels of psilocybin?
We will be doing moderate, definitely not microdose, definitely not macrodose, right there in that moderate realm to kind of replicate the literature in which we're seeing effects on things like anhedonia. Yeah, the microdosing field, we could do a whole other episode.
Yeah, I would
love to be done, not just the anecdotal evidence in that world.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. And I'd love to have you back on to talk about and dissect some of my favorite work from Franz Vollenweider and your time there, because I think that many people in the field don't fully understand how impactful that work is. And how it has reshaped the way we think about psychedelics around the 5-HT2A serotonin system and meaning making and all of this other stuff.
He is a total badass. He's an unsung hero. Katrin Preller as well, who came from his lab and is now leading her own independent lab. Their work is impeccable and it's important. And he's been around and leading the field since the 90s. So sometimes the names, sometimes not all the names are sung as loudly, but yes, great lab, great work.
Yeah, he's one of my role models in the space. And I think just to wrap up, you are working on because we're talking about spreading awareness of everything we're discovering, spreading awareness to the general public, also to the scientific community. You're working on a social media drug education project.
Yes. Yeah. We have two major things happening in the lab right now. I won't go dive deeply because I know we're out of time, but to increase awareness. So one, our social media campaign, you can follow us at _bear_lab. We're just kind of seeking to do this public drug education to kind of try to combat what I talked about earlier in the show is how like the people don't know. No one's ever been told. They've just been told drugs are bad, say no. And I really we're using the campaign to highlight what is public knowledge, right? So we do a lot of interviews of people on the streets, and then we do a lot of corrective stuff and like so this is what the science actually says. One of my favorite things that's coming up right now is a lot of our interviews, kids, they're college students, are referring to hard drugs. And I just love it so much. What is a hard drug? What do you think a hard drug is? And it just shows how non-scientific our conversations around drugs are. 2, we've started a translational team called the Translational Research in Psychedelics, TRIP for short. Right now it's Arizona-based, but we are happy to have anyone from anywhere who's looking for a psychedelic research clinical scientific community. Right now, we're a group of researchers from across Arizona institutions and clinicians. We have MDs, we have LPCs, we have psychiatrists, and of course, students, all who are interested in this field. And we're having once a month meetings to talk about psychedelic news and for people to have a platform to propose their psychedelic research ideas and get feedback from each other. So follow us on social media. If you're interested in joining the TRIP roster, feel free to reach out to me. And happy to have everyone on board. These are our 2 ways of trying to spread the awareness.
Where can people find you and TRIP?
You can email me at bearlab.asu@gmail.com.
And socials?
_bear_lab. That's for Instagram and TikTok.
And that's bear, BEAR, like the animal.
Like the animal spelt in English, not in German.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. I am so grateful. I always enjoy our conversations, and I look forward to more.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Dave.
Thanks for listening to The Psychedelic Report. Visit us at thepsychedelicreport.com. This show is recorded weekly on Clubhouse with a live audience. The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. While I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. So please don't take anything you hear on the Psychedelic Report as personal medical advice, because we don't know you. If you have questions about anything you hear on this show, please consult with your doctor.